any type of virology samples typically can be frozen if you don't have things ready to ship, or you want to ship on a more appropriate day, like earlier in the week, to make sure they
Right.
get there timely.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Karen Grogan. I'm your host today for the Poultry Podcast Show. We have a repeat guest today, Dr. Dan Wilson of Wilson Vet Co., which is a private poultry. Do you consider yourself a consortium or a consulting practice? How do you label yourself, Dan?
Independent veterinarians.
Independent veterinarians, a team of wonderful independent veterinarians that mostly work within the layer industry here in the U.S. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
So Dan and I are going to cover a topic today that I deal with on a daily basis because I work associated with a diagnostic lab. And then Dan is a frequent user of diagnostic labs in different states. And as veterinarians, we both know that sample collection, sample quality, and requesting the right test, all of those things are really important in getting good diagnostics. So, Dan, what are your? Let's start with sample collection, because that's where we need to start maybe. What are your guidelines for like either the techs you're training or sort of your farm managers? What are you looking for? What sort of hallmarks of disease do they tell you? Do you tell them, hey, I need you to call me when X happens?
Yeah, so other times, other presentations outside of this podcast, we bring this topic up a lot. Presenting to clients or doing industry presentations, it's kind of one of our things, as we qualify ourselves as independent veterinarians, but we really like to call ourselves field poultry veterinarians because we're the equivalent of the boots on the ground, seeing the flocks, training people on the farms. And so I do always tell people one of the main things whenever we go to a farm, and what we want our people on the farms or service technicians to be prepared for, is to take a lot of samples. So a lot of that goes back to supplies. Whenever I roll into a farm, I think people chuckle at how much stuff I bring with me. Of course, a good poultry vet could show up with a nice knife or a set of shears and do pretty good work. But, when you've driven multiple hours to the middle of nowhere and you don't have the right supplies, that's always disappointing. Right. When there was one specific thing you needed and you didn't have it, whether that be like, oh, I really need to bleed these birds, or I need, sterile swabs or whirl packs. Like, starting with the basics of always having the supplies is always a big deal for us.
Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
Okay, so that's a good place to start. If we're going to build a kit, either to leave on a farm or to have with you. So you said some good shears, a good knife. What's next?
Well, you got to qualify good for posting shears or a knife. So that's True. Something we see a lot of places.
That has their own specifications of what they really like.
Well, ours might be a whole nother level since we do thousands of birds a year, but
right.
Even for the average person just doing a few birds occasionally, we see people that have, at least they had some effort to get something, but the craft scissors from a Hobby Lobby or
right.
Whatever they could find at the closest convenience store, and it couldn't cut through a piece of paper if you wanted it to. So start with a nice, nice pair of scissors.
Yeah, at least kitchen shears. Like if you can find kitchen shears, like they're meant to cut through bone. Like that is the minimum. I have gotten onto ones that have like almost a spring in the middle, like almost spring loaded. They cut really well through bone.
So definitely something good to get them open and open safely without cutting yourself. But then beyond that,
the folding knives. I've known people that have cut themselves on the ones that fold back. So not the safety with the knives.
Probably the basics. We'd always like people to have stuff with them to bleed birds. Right. Whatever your favorite preference of bleeding method and blood collection from that. But, the basics for actually on the farm, we really like layer service people to have at least a little bit of formalin, and then basic sampling bags, whether that be Whirl packs, and if they don't have that, at least clean new Ziploc type bags.
Clean new Ziplocs, yes, not one that's been reused from your lunch. Yeah, that's not acceptable.
Then we like to have in the layer world, especially with cage-free emerging diseases, we really like people to have transport culture tubes, so culture swab type materials, so they can take a swab if they need to, with a sterile culturant.
Right.
Those are a thing we recommend.
Now, if they're your clients, do you provide those to them? Like they may not be readily available. Can clients go get those from a local diagnostic lab? Like, just kind of need to come from a medical supply place.
I feel like I should have had these here as demos or something.
That's okay. I think everybody knows what those are. So like a culturette kind of swab that has the swab, and then there's a transport, like a soaked sponge at the bottom that helps keep the bacteria alive. Right. That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we distribute them to our clients, and we actually put together our own posting kits if people are interested.
Yeah.
And then some also, we'll give them part numbers where they can buy them or get them from some supplier. That can be one of the stickier, subjects, because sometimes you have to have a business address to ship them to. Right. We found we all work from our homes, and some of the supply companies aren't too keen on sending. Even though they're safe materials, you have to have a proper address to get them to. And sometimes for setting up the account, they ask some strange questions because they're more typical for diagnostic labs or
diagnostic labs,
medical
or
labs,
doctors' offices, or
So you may get those questions, but definitely some people buy them, to have their own little stash.
Formalin, some kind of bag, and then We're moving into the molecular era, right? So what kind of, we'll take samples that are going for that, like especially sometimes swabs. And I feel like that's one area that gets confused a lot is if you are going to send samples for a PCR, and you're doing like tracheal swabs or things like that, like it's a specific type. So how do you help clients get that? Again, that supplied in your kit, or you get those locally from a diagnostic lab?
It usually depends on the state, and what the state prefers the field service people to do. Of course, in the world of high-path AI, they may need special state blessings to do such things. But, at this time, we encourage everyone to have either BHI with them or within an easily retrievable, distance, so that they have that ready, somewhere at a stock location within a pretty easy drive, or, in the case of a mid to large size layer farm, actually have an inventory on hand.
Right. Have like the testing kits with the right swabs, BHI media. Yeah. I think most, at least for us in Georgia, like that's available through our state lab system. We're lucky we have a poultry specific one, but I think the other Nolan labs, you can get those like kind of already like a pre-assembled kit. Yeah. So that makes it easier. Okay. So
shipping coolers and frozen ice packs.
Okay. Why do we have to keep it cold, Dr. Dan?
before we fly, if we're flying for farm visits, that's something. Sometimes we send supplies ahead, and I always make people promise me, you have shipping coolers and ice packs that are actually frozen and ready to be used, right? Because it seems like that should be something some people would think through, but
no.
You'll go through, 6 hours of sampling flocks and be like, hey, we need to get these to overnight shipping tonight. And people look at each other like, in what? Or, oh, I have ice packs, but they're sitting in the back warehouse shelf.
Yeah,
So,
I've had to stop and buy a bag of ice in different places before. Yeah, sure you have too. So what types of samples do we need to keep cold and why?
well, I guess it depends on your proximity to being able to ship. Some places in the country are places to ship from are a lot more readily available to poultry locations.
If you're in the middle of, certain small towns in Nebraska or Iowa, it might take you a couple hours to get to somewhere where you can get to a FedEx drop location.
Right. Or UPS.
Yeah, or UPS. Sorry, not to slight UPS, FedEx or UPS.
Yeah. So, typically most of our bacteriology samples, if they can't go out the same day, basic refrigeration until most convenient, within reason is what we have people do with bacteriology samples or serum. There's no rush to get those out the door unless they're for, regulatory purposes. And then most of the virology related topics like bronchitis genotyping panels or any type of virology samples typically can be frozen if you don't have things ready to ship or you want to ship on a more appropriate day, like earlier in the week, to make sure they get there timely.
Excellent point too. Don't ship things on a Thursday for it to arrive on a Friday, and then it's going to sit all weekend. Yes, we try to send that message out as much as we can. So ship diagnostic samples Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. If you can, if possible. We realize sometimes it happens, but like you said, certain things are more, there is some priority to certain samples. Clearly if you are suspecting a reportable disease, that decision is going to come down to the state and they are going to do those tests like the same day.
Right.
There are certain things and that those have to go to certain laboratories. So that's a regulated type of event. But then, even for within our framework of how poultry works, there's certain things that we would test for, like for moving birds. Maybe not so much, I don't know. If we're going to move like in broiler breeders, we're going to move some males, you need to test them. So sometimes those are time sensitive results, and again, shipping them within an appropriate amount of time to get those samples back. So I was trying to think of an appropriate layer example, but I feel like that don't take this the wrong way, but maybe birds just get moved and then it's like, oh wait, should have tested these, but it's okay.
Yeah, I think with shipping companies, to tread lightly, I think they do a phenomenal job, minus weather, minus potential strikes and other sorts of things. But you do have to be really careful that you ask lots of the right questions, or hopefully even know your delivery person really well to trust them, because we've been bit multiple times dropping them off at locations that said
that they're going to be
if you don't ask, they may like, oh, well, the truck already came today, or today they're not going to come, or there's lots of different little caveats with shipping, like, oh, they only come on 2 days a week. So some of the more local places don't always understand the urgency. Like, this is a very important sample, so I need to make sure it gets out. I'd rather take it with me if you don't think it's going to make it out today. It's just, it's always stuff that's out of your hands, but the more questions you ask, the more hopefully you can avoid lost samples or delayed samples.
Absolutely. You want to know what's going that day. Yeah. So we can hold things like serum or bacteriology samples. So our viral testing tends to be, and maybe mycoplasmas, they fall in their own special category. So those are our focus and things that need to be handled with care and either frozen or refrigerated. But I'm going to rewind for just a second in terms of serum quality. Serum is like the product that we get off of the blood sample that you send. So you send someone out to the farm and they say, hey, I want you to go bleed, house 2. They collect the blood, they leave it sitting on their dash in the sunshine for a couple of days, and then they mail it to the diagnostic lab. Is that a good way to handle it?
No. And this should be your subject to talk more about, but maybe it's more of a layer specific thing or something that we typically train all of our companies to send in only poured off serum. Occasionally we find out farms, forgot or weren't trained and ship in whole blood, which can be used, but the jostling of shipping.
It's going to clot in the process. It's better if you do pour off the serum.
Right.
Right. So how do you train your people to get good quality serum?
Most layers provide pretty good yield on serum, especially birds middle-aged and, in lay, they're drinking lots of fluids and they yield pretty good serum. Sometimes pullets and older layers tend to be a little less hydrated and yield less serum for a variety of reasons. But when we have people collecting serum, we always, for one, we try to, give them a list of the best tubes that they can use for more.
Do you recommend those little plastic bullet tubes?
So what we use as the vets and what we tell people to use are the beaded tubes.
Oh, okay.
So there's tubes with silicone beads and that helps with the surface area in the tube. You get more yield off of that. We tell people never to put the samples in your pockets. So either a little cardboard box or some kind of tray. If you can lay the sample flat and try not to touch it for the first few minutes, that really helps the clot set sideways, where in the past we've had people like, I'm just going to walk the chicken house and just stick them in my chest pocket or my pant pocket. And then you're climbing the cages to catch birds, running after birds, or just the walking itself. And that jostling while the clot's setting is not making it work out as well as it could in the end. And then, if you do all of those things right, you can get pretty good yield within a few hours. So we do tell people to generally leave it overnight just to get the best full yield off of it, and then pour it off.
Room temperature. Right. Yes. So set the blood. I like the laying it down. That definitely gets better clot formation if you can. Leave it overnight, room temperature. And then pour the serum. It's a straw colored fluid that'll form over the clot. That's what we run, a majority of diagnostic tests on. And then how do you handle the serum afterwards?
I don't know if this one's written in stone, but, once you have the serum poured off, assuming it was collected pretty clean and the samples, kind of translucent, yellow, we tell people you can leave it in refrigeration for maybe up to a week. And then if you're going to leave it beyond that and try to ship things together, you can freeze it, with the caveat of MG plate testing, which a lot of
no frozen serum.
MG plate tested, so making sure they understand they can't run that or can't trust the result entirely as a plate test itself. But so we have people that obviously shipping is sometimes a lot more than the serology cost itself. So if you have a lot of flocks that need to be submitted at once for some routine serology, you can kind of collect things over a few weeks and ship them in clusters. If it's not going to be some kind of compliance testing or
you're just running a lot.
If it's more for just routine baselines and things, it can be saved and shipped together as a group.
Okay. So we covered that blood sampling quality. I think that's one that gets, we still, even though I think there's a lot of people out there educating to send good samples, we still get our fair share of sometimes there's just not, the volume is too small, so they don't take those extra steps to get good separation of the clot and in the serum. So they just get a very small amount, or they didn't get a good, blood draw the first time, just didn't get enough sample. So then we end up, maybe barely enough to run, whatever tests need to be run. It's always better to send extra serum. Like, don't, try to send as little as possible. Like, send everything to the diagnostic lab, because you never know if some test needs to be repeated. And then at least every diagnostic lab I know, like we kind of bank samples for a while, so that if, like, say you get the results, you're like, you know what, that isn't really what I was expecting. Can you do X, Y, and Z? If we have another test we can run on the serum, like let's say you did the plate test. Oh, I don't know. Let's run it on ELISA. Like if you just ordered one serologic test, sometimes you can, so send as much serum as you have. Don't just, meter it out, send it all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we still sometimes get bad samples, but not as frequently as we used to.
One we get questions about a lot is formalin fixed samples, which on the layer world, we don't do as much as I probably used to, but definitely, for ruling out wet pox versus LT versus bacterial tracheitis, that's still a gold standard in addition to PCRs and such. But we get that question almost, feels like every time, of whether it needs to be refrigerated and frozen. And so we always coach people through, once it's in the jar, it's actually better to be left.
Once it's in the jar, it can sit there forever. Yes. Once it's in formalin, it can stay there. I think the thing that most people do wrong in that is the ratio. Is you need a very small piece, like, a centimeter by like a small chunk of tissue. If you send in a big piece of liver or something, it's not going to fix, so if you have a smaller formalin jar, you just need take multiple small pieces instead of the big chunk. I think that's the thing we see from a diagnostic lab is the error is that things don't fix. So that formalin has to kind of leach into the tissue and get all the way in, so that then it gets embedded in paraffin wax, and then it gets sliced and stained. And then the pathologist can actually diagnose if it's wet pox or LT or, a bacterial infection. So that is the biggest thing we see.
Yeah, I think then you have people that do all of that right, but then we also have concerns with it freezing. So they may not freeze it on purpose.
In the winter, they might freeze it on purpose. It's it gets stuck on a FedEx plane I've had samples in my own truck and I'm in a hotel for the night, and I'm there going to sleep at 10 or 11 p.m. And I think, oh no, my formalin samples are in my car and I've got to go get it out. Oops. 11 p.m. or something. So that definitely can affect the quality and make a histopathologist confused or sad or mad. Right.
We take our formalin jars and winterize them in the colder months.
You put a little antifreeze in it or something?
We put a little bit of isopropyl alcohol in, or a certain percent.
That's what happens when you live where it's cold, Dan.
That was apparently a swine thing, so...
Probably. Well, David Swain is super smart, so... He probably figures things out way before anybody else. That's an excellent tip. So if you're, in our more northern climates or up in Canada, winterize your formalin. And the key there in terms of it freezing, and you kind of alluded to this, it confuses the pathologist. So when tissues are frozen and then thawed, they degrade, the tissue quality kind of breaks down. So you really don't want to freeze it. That is less than ideal.
Another topic we try to coach people through when collecting samples or doing farm postings, and even ourselves, I have to remind myself almost every week, once that bird is dead and you're sampling it, it's not going to be undead anymore. So you need to make sure you sample everything you need to make your trip there, the euthanasia or death of the bird the most valuable. And sometimes time is a limitation, but you're really not spending that much money to collect something. So I always say try to sample everything but the cluck, because things can always sit in the fridge for a few days or sit in formalin for months.
We call it a bird in a jar.
Right? I don't know how many times, probably once a month, I think, why did I not take that? I thought about it, but now in retrospect, I could have I already would have had it. Nobody has to go back to the farm. And so that's a big category. If there's any remote idea you have that crosses your mind while you're there, just take it and think about it on the drive home, or ask the producer later, do you want to run this test? You're not spending anything but a couple pennies for the bags or, the culture swabs or something like that. So definitely worth sampling everything you think you may need and then some. I
think that is excellent advice, because just like you said, like then you have to either make a return trip or have them, bring, like for us, bring more birds to the diagnostic lab. That is excellent advice in terms of take anything you think. We have to clean out our freezers, because we tend to do that in terms of we'll save back, like, oh, I'm going to throw tracheas and kidneys and bursas and all this stuff into the freezer that I might want later. And then,
always feels better to be a sample hoarder.
Right.
And then when you go to clean it out, I think the formalin ones are the most interesting, because, they can stay in storage for so long. And when we go to discard those, sometimes it can be a year or two. And I think, like, what was I even thinking?
What did I think this for?
I find a jar of like testicles or something. And I'm like, what was the point of these?
That's not really what you like. You don't see very many males in your lot of work working in layers.
There are some.
Okay. Oh, that's true. I guess you do see some layer breeders. So true. Okay. So another thing that comes up a lot is, like, when you're trying to test things in the environment, like water, feed, sometimes we have people want to do things with, darkling beetles or so. Any advice on those types of samples?
Have someone else do it.
So where should a feed sample come from? Like, if you say, hey, I think this is something in the feed, where should you get the feed?
Wherever the nutritionist tells you to.
Okay. You're going to defer to the nutritionist? Come on. Just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, some of those are a little opinion related. Like when it comes to feed, depending on the severity of the problem, the nutritionist in likelihood would have their own, idea of feed mill samples, or retained finished feed would be great. As far as on the farm, definitely you get, people maybe try to collect it in the wrong place, where you're trying to get an even representation of what the birds were fed. And so trying to pinch some out of a feed trough or some feed off of the floor or something obviously isn't really representative of the finished feed. Yeah. So ideally a representative from a bin or somewhere that hasn't been sorted through by the birds yet.
Right. They pick out what they want. So then you don't see what the feed is, right? And then the other thing that I feel like customers get frustrated with is, well, the feed came back perfectly normal. So how do you explain that to your clients? But you're convinced it's still something.
I talked to the nutritionist.
True. I feel like a lot of things that we may think, oh, it's, I just feel like they've consumed, like, the birds eat through, and then you see, whatever's happened. Like, say there were high mycotoxins and you had a bunch of, who knows, mouth lesions or whatever. You may not find it. Like, that stuff is so, high levels at certain times, and you just may miss it. That's the other thing that there's only certain labs that run certain tests when it comes to things like that, like feed or water analysis. Like, make sure where you're sending things, they can actually do the test. That's the other, I think, for most diagnostic labs, only, they either send it on to another lab. They don't maybe necessarily have those in-house tests. So make sure where you're sending things actually does the testing you want.
Yeah, I think even in the 10 or so years that I've been a poultry vet, I feel like less and less that we attribute things to the feed. Maybe that's modernization of feed mill equipment, batching systems and quality control methods in the mills. But, most of those bigger nutrition problems are macro things. It's not as common that we see like this one flock tanks and it's something obvious like salt is way out of balance, or they forgot limestone. Like, I mean, they do happen, but most of the finesse type nutrition things, I don't think we see as much as some people want to believe, or blame the feed, I guess. Yeah. So we see a lot more low hanging fruit, like management, basic diseases, and those sort of things. But that's me also staying away from nutrition and feed notes because they're out of my realm.
It is not my thing. Okay, so now you have your sampling, your results are back. So in terms of keeping up with diagnostics, I know you're a big database, kind of person. How do you, for someone who's working with multiple companies like you do, you're getting reports from multiple labs. How do you sort of track that? Do you track that for your clients? Do you help them set up a way to track it? Do you expect them to check the results? Like, how does that second step happen?
It really is company dependent, and if it's associated with a regulatory program as well, how much we're involved. We do have our own system that we track the progress of diagnostics, and then the final diagnostic, and then the same system we put all of our notes that we share back to the client if we put interpretations on it. In an email, we also save them in our other system because we don't trust email as our primary file source.
It's not a record keeping system, no.
But yeah, we definitely do that, and I know PDRC is kind of on the very beginning of a new system to do this cloud-based.
The very beginnings of a new client portal, yes.
So hopefully more and more labs move that direction. I know personally our favorite labs have internet and cloud-based lab tracking software to get case updates, and that's extremely helpful. Better than sitting, for a week or two wondering where the status of a diagnostic is, or constantly bugging, accessioning people where their results are and stuff. So those are definitely very helpful for us.
I think technology is going to help on those systems for, all diagnostic labs, not just specifically, but in terms of, faster access. And I think the other thing is, previous systems just emailed you, tons of results. So then your email gets full and you're like, I don't want to deal with this. So having a portal where you just go in and you get your results.
It just streamlines the accession process as well, especially if the veterinarian or, some animal health professional is involved with the process, then there's less likelihood of the wrong tests being selected, money wasted, or time delays in getting the right thing tested. And with some of the better online submission portals, we just basically can write down the case number and put it in the shipping box instead of like, I got to find a printer. I got to fill out this form by hand.
It goes in the box, right?
Nobody gets to see my handwriting because now it's all nicely typed. And sometimes we'll even ship stuff, and while the sample's in shipment, I'll go in the form online and say, I actually wanted to add these tests before it gets there. So
nice.
I think those things really, really help prevent error in the accessioning process and make sure it's the right info for the flock and makes it back to the right owner and those sort of things. I have to tell a story about this because this came up Friday-ish, maybe this is
on a Friday.
This is Dr. Yuko Sato's story to tell, but she sent me this image. Everyone still receives a lot of handwritten accessions, and I guess this person accidentally stacked some papers together, so they received a submission form for some type of bird. They also received their copy of a blueberry muffin recipe attached to it. So it makes you chuckle a little bit, but definitely getting away from handwritten papers can avoid sending your blueberry muffins recipe in
by accident. Well, at least it was just a blueberry muffin recipe. It wasn't like, your tax evasion notice or like something really racy. Like
I'm sure you guys have seen crazy things on submission forms.
working with nature and not against it. Chickens fed AX3 Digest consume significantly less feed and water to produce 1 pound of meat. Successful flock performance is determined during the first 10 days post-placement. AX3 Digest is a highly digestible novel protein that most improved in barn performance, bird health, and a drier litter. For more information, visit www.protecta.com.
Here's my personal pet peeve is the lack of information in a submission form. And I think that's what the electronic submission is going to help, is that you will then be able to put in extra information. Like, give me actual numbers when you say your mortality is increased. Are we talking 10 more birds per day or 100 birds per day? Like, this is what I need to know. All I get is high mortality. That is the vaguest history. And you can talk to probably even Dr. Sato at Iowa State gets the same thing. Like, it is so non-specific. And like, tell me what you're seeing. I know you didn't just, go based off of mortality. I know that you are seeing something. So I think the electronic submissions will allow us, you're going to be able to put in more detail and potentially allow, like you're saying, a veterinarian to type in the things, because you would be at a desk and you're going to know what the service tech told you, and you're going to be putting in the electronic submission. That I think is going to be invaluable in terms of then the labs can turn around and give you better results, because, it is bad information in that we're not going to give you what you're looking for. So to me, what I usually see that's usually more shocking is how things get submitted, like what people bring birds in. I have a picture somewhere stashed away. When I was a student, this guy brought his 2 silky chickens in a Bud Light box. So it's more of how things show up at our door. Yeah, I hopefully he didn't drink it on the drive there. So things like that. And then that is my other thing, because we are in a poultry area. We will have people bring us live birds, and they'll put birds in a box and not cut like air holes. And that's another one of my pet peeves. Like, if you want us to do, just take care of them until you get there. If you're putting them in a cardboard box, give them a little oxygen. There's a gap at the top, but little details like that can, it's how they show up sometimes. And the other thing to get good if you're in a drivable distance to a diagnostic lab where you have clients, is if you have something that is creating increased mortality, don't forget to bring us fresh dead birds too. Sometimes people will just bring live birds for a necropsy and they may not be affected. If you have something that's causing very acute mortality, then we may not see a thing because you picked the healthy birds. So bring me fresh, not the ones from 3 days ago, fresh, that morning's mortality. And if you find affected birds, because there are some things, it can happen so quickly, you may not have, so that's my other tidbit. We can talk about this for hours.
Instruction clarity is huge.
Clarity, very big. Yes.
You think you sound like a broken record, maybe because we do this every week, but some people,
you do.
Like an example for us to mirror that, we'll tell people I want to see 10 mortality, and that particular day, maybe they only had 6.
Yeah.
And so the house person isn't told what that means. So they just make 4 more dead.
They make 4 more dead.
You're like,
they're going to cervically dislocate them and create the 4 more because you said you wanted 10. They're following directions.
Yeah.
Yes. That is, and I don't know if, I feel like that there is as our industry is changing generationally, there is a lack of almost like information transfer and carry down. We are just, like the people that, we kind of deal with different aspects of the industry, but the people that are out there every day, like there's just things that, maybe, I know you've only been at this 10 years ago, but I've been at this 20 years ago. Like 20 years ago, they would have just known that, and they would have just diagnosed it on the farm, and I would not have had it as a submission. And so I don't know where that, like, do you feel like you see that on the layer side, that just some of that like institutional knowledge is not getting passed along?
I think though, and layers, in everyone's defense, young or old or experienced or not, we're also going through this retransition back to cage-free and
true. You have a lot of changes going. Yeah.
So
I think the same's across other industries, things, turkeys and broilers moving to organic and outdoor access. And maybe not to the percentage that layers are, but true.
I mean, diagnosing gout and E. coli peritonitis and pox, those were basics that someone 30 years ago could do really well. But now you're saying, well, that peritonitis might also be erysipelas, fowl cholera, galactobacterium.
You have all these crazy bacteria that you used to not see in cage layers. Come on now. They're not complicating at all.
So in a way, we have to encourage even more diagnostics than ever before, because, we get fooled. I had a case this past month that I could have swore was fowl cholera on the farm, just straight up, and it ended up being all pathogenic E. coli. So your eyes can fool you.
They can fool you. I had a case the other day. Here is your lesson to run a culture. I had a case. I was like, oh, it'll be E. coli. It was a daggum salmonella. I still don't even know which one, because I had to send it for PCR, because it just came back. When we get a salmonella, we group it. So I got the group, and then I was like, well, I don't really know what that's going to be. But it was clearly causing, it had a okay, we're going to talk veterinarian, beautiful pericarditis and the bacterial showering in the liver. And I was like, this is what's creating this illness in the chicken. So it was a pathogenic salmonella, which it's a little odd. We don't necessarily see that every day. So I'm still waiting. Here I am as a veterinarian waiting on results. But that, again, is, I could have just looked at that and said, oh, it's E. coli, run some tetracyclines and be done. But this is your lesson to run a culture.
Yep.
So it's not always what it looks. And I have overheard people that say, oh, that looks like, whatever, like based on what the lesion looks like in the bird. No, you need to run a culture. Like, again, you thought it was fowl cholera. And I have seen several cases lately. We have, we've isolated this mostly in broiler breeders. It's called Castellaniella, and it's just this odd bacteria, and it creates like edema and swelling, like in wattles, and again, looks like Pasteurella, comes back as this totally other different bacteria. So run a culture. Don't assume what it is, because these days you might be wrong. Like you're saying, like erysipelas, and we have all these going to cage-free and outdoor access, and we have, unusual bacteria like Campylobacter hepaticus, and got to figure out what all those things are.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot more culture work done on layers in the U.S. in the near future, I think.
Right. So in terms of, I think we've kind of covered that, and we're kind of alluding to these, changes in terms of cage-free and the type of production and where we're headed. How do you see veterinarians sort of, fitting into that? And in terms of supporting that transition for the egg industry, and, I think we play an extremely important role. So as a person who's dealing with those transitions, how do you see that happening over the next 5 years?
Definitely straight up. I think more farm locations will need more vet visits, directly by a veterinarian, but also training service technician type people, production managers, new skills on sampling, being, like we talked about earlier, like having all the right supplies and those sort of things. There was cage production facilities that didn't have disease challenges for 5-10 years at a time. So, on autopilot with their vaccine programs, and things were phenomenal. And so much of this with cage-free transitions is not going to be the same set it and forget it kind of program. So I think that there will have to be more veterinarians doing it and training people to do more hands-on work with disease programs for sure. I think that many of them are manageable, but we're going to have a lot of change of mindset on vaccine programs, and it probably will change. It already has changed the way that layer vaccine programs will be done now and in the future. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Well, I think that is a great place for us to wrap up. Any other fine points of advice that you would have for layer vets, anybody in the poultry industry in terms of being ready when something happens and you need to do a little sleuthing?
Probably the same theme as before. When in doubt, sample it. So
great.
We as veterinarians are being fooled on the daily. So definitely the farm service type people are going to need to do a lot more sampling than just guessing on what problems they may have. So when in doubt, run the diagnostic. I think people have been afraid of either the cost or the shipping costs of diagnostics or the fear of never having done that diagnostic before. And those things kind of delay, getting the program in line with where it needs to go. So when in doubt, run the diagnostics and run them early and actually use the information. Probably the big keys for me.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks for making a return appearance on the Poultry Podcast Show. And it was great to talk to you again, Dan.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.